Hi. Um, the 2020 election was rigged, or no, the 2020 election was rigged. Tired of hearing that. Um, I am too. Uh, Especially since if he would have won in 2020, he would have served his term, and today he would not be president because it would be the third term. Although we know that he doesn't exactly feel like that applies to him or anything. But it's a I think there's a lot of reasons to be afraid right now when it comes to what's going to happen between now and the midterms. And I wanted to talk about it, get my feelings out about it, vent about it. Um, when I talk about it, maybe it makes me feel better, just to get it out of my system. But when you look at the Republican Party, they're really the projectionist party. When they say the election is rigged, that's because that's what they do. When Trump says anything to anybody else, he's projecting. So if he calls somebody dumb, he's dumb. Anything he claims somebody else is, he is. They're the projectionist party. They're also the bumper sticker party. You can't get cohesive statements out of them on anything. Everything they say is in just 4 or 5 words. The election was stolen. And then if you try to get cohesive explanations out of them, they'll divert whatever you're talking about to Biden. Biden's lap. Well, they're not doing the Biden's laptop anymore, but they keep going back to Biden. And Biden is not in the Epstein files. And, oh, Epstein. Keep saying it, Epstein. But when it comes to the elections that are coming up, I am really afraid of what's going to happen. I mean, Trump has even actually suggested. I mean, when he says things, it's because he's thinking about it. He wants to do it. So he actually said, "How can we even have to run about these people?" And he always says and I won't say election. They say cancel the election because the fake news would say he wants the elections canceled. He's a dictator. It's he is saying it because he's wanting to do it. He's wanting to find some way to not have the elections because they're not going to work in their favor, unless they can steal, unless they can rig it, unless they can rig it. And we should be thinking about that too. It's very possible that the elections are not going to be valid. They're not going to be safe. They're not going to be accurate. They're going to be rigged. And Trump, fired anyone that would possibly stop him. He calls them rhinos. If they stand up for democracy against him, and then he puts idiots like Kash Patel, Pam Bondi, Tulsi Gabbard, Christy Noem, RFK. Just Dr. Z, is it Z? Is it or Oz? I'm sorry, Oz, Dr. Oz. So he puts idiots in charge of entire government functions where they're just so not qualified to do it, and it's because he wants them to fall apart. But but now he's into the retribution part of things. But we need the midterm elections to restore sanity in our government again, and Trump knows that, and he's petrified. He's a scared guy. He's a scared little dude. Well, big dude, but his everything, his brain is dumb, and it's anyway. I don't want to get started on that, but he knows that if Congress shifts over to the other side, there's going to be accountability, and he's so afraid of that because he knows what's going to happen. He knows that there's going to be people going after him the same way he goes after everyone else, but they're going to be doing it for valid reasons instead of just the made up reasons you didn't agree with Trump kind of reasons, instead of it not being democratic. So they're very afraid of what's going to happen, and with the whole thing with 2020, compare that for a moment to when Bush beat Gore in the elections, where it came down to like a few hundred votes in Florida, and they had the whole hanging Chad issue. Bush's brother Jeb was governor of the state, and and he's the one responsible for for making sure everything was all right with it. And when Gore conceded, then he unconceded, then he conceded again. But did he ever say it was rigged? Even with all the weird things that happened. I mean, they even had one vote or one kind of election in one place that was mostly his, where the ballot itself was so weird looking that people voted for a third party candidate and by mistake because they didn't understand the ballot itself. So that could have been something that that Gore could have stood on top of, to try to fight it even more. But you never hear anyone on the Democratic side saying it was rigged, it was rigged, or anything, or saying that it's not right or anything. But Trump just can't shut up about it. I just wish he'd shut up. I wish he would shut up. I really do. But but now they're claiming that Democrats are stealing elections when it's them who are doing their best to steal the elections. They're going to have. I know they're going to have ICE agents at voting booths. To scare anyone of brown color. And if you have, if I was brown color, I would wear a MAGA hat. During the elections, they probably would let you through. But I'm hearing now that MAGA hats are kind of disappearing because they've been turning on him. When he hasn't done the things that he claimed that he would do. So I don't know. Maybe that's one thing that they could do. But then you got Texas redistricting. And they freaked out when California responded by doing it. But then they keep trying. Florida and Indiana and Ohio. Then they're claiming that immigrants and dead people were voting. They found something like 475 dead people ballots in 2020 in 6 battlefield states. And most of those ballots, 400 is not going to change an election of millions, multi-millions. It's not going to do it. And they found that most of the time it was a family member that had cast the vote. And, I don't know any more about the reasons for it than that. But believe me, the dead people are not changing the elections. It's as true as the immigrants eating our dogs and cats. You don't even hear that anymore. Once the election was over, he shut up about it. Of course, now we have Epstein to talk about. But but then Trump claims that voting by mail is fraud. Trump voted by mail. His immigrant wife votes. Then they sued the manufacturers of voting machines where they lost, and then they lost that. And and did they use our money to do that, to file those suits against them? Did my tax dollars go into these suits against these companies? I don't know. They sued many states. And saying that their elections were not valid. And they were turned down by judges, every judge, even conservative judges, even ones that Trump put in there, ruled against them on things. And they're threatening election officials. Look at the one lady who had to go into hiding, after the election down in, I think that was Georgia. And she had to go into hiding because she's being threatened by everybody. The government and by MAGA, is going after them. And now you have the Supreme Court where we had some vastly unqualified people that Trump appointed, Republican senators, got them into there, and most of the time they give Trump what he wants because that's why he put him there, was to get what he wants, not to have justice. But anyway, they've weakened the civil rights voting act, which screws with Florida, and it eliminates black votes. That's what they want. They want to get rid of that stuff. Or how about that whole thing where they want to have people show a passport or a birth certificate to vote? How many people don't go out of the country and don't have passports? And do you carry your passport around with you anywhere? I have a passport somewhere. I went to England a few years ago. Not sure I could find it really quickly, but I sure don't want to have to find it, when I'm going to vote. My birth certificate, no clue, where that would be. Or if you're a woman and you don't have a a passport, but so now it's up to whether or not you can come up with your birth certificate. But you got married and you changed your name. Your birth certificate is not going to match your name on your driver's license. Not going to do that. So it eliminates female votes, makes it harder for them to vote. So it makes it harder for the black people to vote. What's going on with Supreme Court. This makes it harder for women to vote. These are two parts. If they, those are two different areas that usually a lot of time more would vote for Democrats than they would Republicans. So Republicans really want to they're fine with just eliminating those people's rights to votes. They're totally fine with it. Um, then they're overriding state election laws. States are allowed to have they're the ones that run their elections, not the federal government. And they're trying to put the federal government in charge of these states. They've had the FBI, demanding voting records from the states. They don't have a right to do that. What's the FBI getting involved with that for? They should not be involved with that at all. And they want to they want to nationalize, voting. I mean, that's what happens in countries where you want to consolidate power at the top. That's what you do, and that's what they're doing. That's what they're trying to do, and that's how you destroy democracy. And sending an FBI in a raid to Georgia to seize ballot boxes, that's fine with them. They'll do that. But when there's a raid on Trump, in Mar-a-Lago, where he has committed treason by stealing top secret information and storing it in his frickin' bathroom, oh no, you can't have the FBI do that. But then when it comes to stealing the state election information that's run by states, they're fine with that. There's stuff we need to change, when it comes to voting. There really is. I agree that gerrymandering is bad. I don't like it by either side. Both sides do it. I would love if they could somehow find a way to put a nonpartisan, non-governmental organization in that would help create, decide what districts would look like, and then it's not run by, it's not influenced, by one party, by whatever party's in charge at the time on things. So I would love it if there was something like that. I think also getting rid of the electoral college, it should be a popular vote, for presidency and thing. It shouldn't be electoral college. I mean, they did that, I think, to make it so that smaller states were not bullied by larger states. But that's what the Senate is for. That's why a state like New Jersey it's the same number of senators as the state of California. That gives them strength, in the Senate, which is an important, part of our government. But then when it comes to Congress, they shouldn't have as much as the states that are more populous, because we're trying to do what's right for the population, in general, and try to take care of the ones that we can. But we don't want to have you don't want to have smaller states with a smaller population that might have way different viewpoints than most of the United States, having an outsized influence on the government to do it. So we already have these things, but so now I'm looking at, it's, what are we now? We're at May, so we've got half a year to the midterm elections, and right now, MAGA's deserting Trump, and he knows it. He's panicking. I'm just really afraid of what they're going to do, what Trump is going to do, and his toadies on the right side, his projection party, what they're going to do to make these elections not what they should be. And I'm very afraid of what's going to happen with that. I hope that judges and other officials make it so this doesn't happen. I just don't know what's going to happen with it. But I guess I just wanted to talk about it, get it out of my system. I feel a little better, but I'm gonna be panicking myself till up until November is concerned, and then hopefully we can put some cuffs on Trump. I wish we could put actual cuffs on him, but try stop him from putting us into a war illegally. Where you're supposed to have congressional approval to do it. I mean, that's their act, not his. The things that he's doing, all with his stupid signing some big piece of paper with his really ugly, stupid writing that looks just as bad when it's on the part of a poster of a young girl. Epstein, Epstein, Epstein. Okay, I'm done. My website, www.normcowie.com. That's COWIE. I've had 5 short stories in the last few months that have been published in places, all having to do with disability and very weird stuff, including like amazing stories. So if you check out my website, you can go on there. There's a link to some of the ones that are up there. But anyway, thank you for listening, watching all that stuff, and midterms, please, midterms. All right, bye bye.